At 14:17 local time, the first irregularity appeared on the carrier's surface search radar. 3 contacts emerged almost at once. At first, they were small, faint, and loosely grouped. For a moment, they could have passed as ordinary naval traffic. Then their speed changed. In less than 2 minutes, all 3 contacts accelerated. Inside the Combat Information Center, no one reacted dramatically. They never do. The tracks were marked, time-stamped, and categorized. Course, speed, bearing, range, every detail was recorded. The watch team had seen patterns like this before, and at sea, patterns matter more than intentions. The contacts were Venezuelan warships. They were operating outside territorial waters, well inside international shipping lanes. That by itself was not unusual. What drew attention was their direction. All 3 ships were moving on converging courses, angled not to pass by, but to draw closer. The predicted closest point of approach was recalculated, then checked again. Each time, the distance was smaller. On the bridge, nothing outwardly changed. No abrupt maneuvering, no visible sign of concern. The aircraft carrier stayed on course, and her escorts held formation. At sea, one rule comes first. Never broadcast uncertainty. Every movement sends a message, whether intended or not. At 14:23, the officer of the deck approved the first radio call. The transmission was calm and professional, sent over an open maritime channel. Identification was requested. Intent was asked to be clarified. The message was repeated exactly as protocol required, first in English, then in Spanish. No reply came. In naval encounters, silence is never meaningless. By then, the Venezuelan ships were no longer simply passing through. Their speed had settled at a level that did not match routine patrol behavior. Their spacing became tighter. One vessel shifted 5 degrees to port, subtle but unmistakable. Another answered with a matching move to starboard. This was not random positioning. Inside the Combat Information Center, analysts started building the full picture. Historical records were pulled in, earlier encounters, known capabilities, familiar command behavior. Nothing indicated an immediate strike. But it was clearly a challenge, and challenges are measured carefully, never guessed at. At 14:28, the carrier strike group shifted into a higher state of awareness. No alarms sounded, no announcements rolled through the passageways. The transition was quiet, procedural, controlled, almost invisible to anyone not trained to spot it. Sensor coverage widened. Electronic surveillance systems began passive recording. Nothing unnecessary was transmitted. One of the oldest myths about aircraft carriers is that they are massive, sluggish machines that rely only on brute force. The truth is far more precise. A carrier controls the sea not through speed or aggression, but through information, layered defense, and timing. And now, time had become the deciding element. At 14:31, an escort destroyer established visual contact through its optics. 3 gray hulls, naval ensigns visible, deck crews in place, no weapons openly manned, no obvious signs of combat preparation. But at sea, posture matters more than appearances. The Venezuelan ships were still closing in. On the American side, no one raised their voice. No order was rushed. Every step followed doctrine refined through decades of maritime encounters. Doctrine built around one central idea: control the escalation. The objective was not to win a confrontation. The objective was to make sure one never had to happen. As the distance continued to narrow, the carrier's captain reviewed the incoming data in silence. Range, relative motion, communications, behavior. Everything suggested a deliberate move. Pressure without open provocation, proximity without direct action. A test. What the Venezuelan commanders almost certainly understood was that an aircraft carrier represents power. What they may not have fully accounted for was what it also represents: restraint backed by overwhelming capability. At 14:34, clearance was given for the next step. Not weapons, not warnings, presence. Because at sea, the moment just before escalation is often the moment that matters most. Out on open water, escalation rarely begins with weapons. Everything begins with distance. By 14:36 local time, the 3 Venezuelan warships had moved in close enough that their approach could no longer be dismissed as accidental. Their formation tightened once more, each ship holding disciplined spacing, moving as a single coordinated unit rather than separate patrol vessels. This was no longer coincidence. It was intent, written in geometry. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical picture was sharp and undeniable. 3 surface tracks, parallel vectors, small speed corrections carefully designed to shrink the gap without crossing the line into an immediate defensive response. It was the kind of maneuver meant to create pressure, enough to be noticed, not enough to justify a hard reaction. The carrier strike group did not change course. That choice was deliberate. In naval doctrine, holding course under pressure sends a clear message: confidence. Turning too soon invites interpretation. It can suggest uncertainty or worse, retreat. So the carrier stayed steady and her escorts did the same, maintaining a moving perimeter that spoke for itself. At 14:39, a second series of radio calls went out. Once again, the tone was professional. Once again, it remained neutral. Identification, safety advisory, a reminder of international navigation standards. The message was transmitted twice, first in English, then in Spanish. Every call was logged, every second was recorded. Still, there was no response. When silence repeats, it stops being silence. It becomes information. Electronic surveillance teams moved into full passive collection. No jamming, no active radar targeting, only listening. Every radar sweep, every navigation signal emitted by the Venezuelan ships was captured, examined, and stored. In modern naval encounters, the information gathered in a few minutes can influence decisions for years. Up on the flight deck, everything still looked routine. Aircraft remained parked, crews moved with steady, unhurried precision. To an untrained observer, nothing seemed out of place. That calm was intentional. Visible composure lowers the risk of miscalculation on the other side. But below deck, readiness had already changed. Aviation crews were placed on standby, not for immediate launch, but for immediate availability. Helicopter teams reviewed their assignments. Surveillance packages were prepared. Cameras were checked and aligned. Everything was made ready without spectacle. This was not about intimidation. It was about keeping every option open. At 14:42, one Venezuelan warship adjusted course slightly, edging closer to the strike group's outer screen. The change was small, less than 10 degrees, but the effect was immediate. The projected closest point of approach dropped again. Time to CPA was now measured in minutes. The bridge crew showed no outward reaction. The log did. Every movement was recorded with exacting detail. Course changes, speed shifts, rudder angles, relative bearing. This was not only operational tracking, it was legal groundwork. In maritime confrontations, documentation can matter just as much as dominance. At this point, the encounter was still technically unarmed. No guns were visibly trained, no launch systems were opened, but the lack of visible weapons did not mean the lack of pressure. Pressure was being applied through distance, through persistence, through the refusal to break away, and pressure moves in both directions. By now, the carrier strike group's layered defenses were fully aligned, even if outwardly silent. Surface, air, and electronic elements were working as one. At the center of it all, the carrier remained steady, projecting control rather than threat. That kind of control carries its own weight. Aircraft carriers are built not only to fight wars, but to keep them from starting. Their presence compresses decision-making for anyone who chooses to test them. Every close approach forces the other side to think beyond the immediate moment, beyond the visible horizon, beyond the first move. At 14:45, the next step was approved. Not a move upward in tension, but outward in visibility. Authorization was given for aerial presence. A helicopter launch is not a sign of aggression. It is a sign that nothing is being missed. Eyes moved into the sky, sensors reached farther, and the record became clearer. It was a non-lethal step meant to read intent without forcing a direct clash. The order moved quietly through the chain. On the flight deck, crews responded with practiced precision. No shouting, no rushing, just calm efficiency. The aircraft was being readied not to intimidate, but to observe. Cameras, infrared systems, and communications gear became the tools that mattered most. As the helicopter prepared to lift, the Venezuelan warships kept coming, maintaining speed and formation. They still had not crossed any hard boundary, but they were moving straight toward one. And now they were about to be seen with far greater clarity. At sea, the moment pressure becomes visible is often the moment it begins to lose its power. What followed would not rely on force. It would rely on presence, proof, and patience. And more than once, that combination has ended tense encounters far more effectively than weapons ever could. At 14:48 local time, the helicopter rose from the deck. No announcement followed, no visible urgency broke the rhythm of the ship. Only the controlled lift of spinning rotors cutting through the air above the strike group. To an outside observer, it might have looked routine. To those tracking the encounter, it marked a decisive shift. The situation had moved beyond surface positioning and into layered control. The aircraft climbed to a modest altitude, then turned outward, picking up speed as it headed toward the 3 Venezuelan warships. Its mission was not to threaten. Its mission was to observe, identify, and document. In modern naval operations, cameras and sensors often matter more than firepower. The moment it cleared the deck, the helicopter's sensor package went to work. Electro-optical cameras fixed on the nearest vessel. Infrared systems traced engine heat and exhaust patterns. Every image was time-stamped. Every bearing was recorded. Nothing was left to guesswork. Below, the carrier and her escorts held formation. They did not move closer. They did not pull away. They simply waited. As the helicopter crossed the space between the two forces, the Venezuelan ships came into sharp focus. Hull numbers could be read, flags were clearly visible, deck crews moved across the ships, some stopping to look up as the aircraft approached. No weapons appeared to be manned, no openly hostile gestures were made, but posture at sea is measured by more than visible weapons. The helicopter slowed and established a lateral orbit at a safe distance. This was not a dramatic pass overhead. It was controlled, deliberate presence, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to avoid unnecessary risk. A standard advisory was transmitted. Clear, professional, and neutral. Position, intent, and safety expectations were stated plainly. Then the message was repeated in Spanish. At sea, tone often matters as much as wording. This time, there was an answer. It was brief and vague, an acknowledgement without any real commitment. The Venezuelan ships did not change course at once, but the silence had finally been broken. That alone changed the atmosphere of the encounter. Inside the Combat Information Center, analysts followed every detail. Communication patterns were logged. Signal strength was measured. Even the shortest reply can reveal a great deal. Crew readiness, command discipline, the speed of decision-making. The helicopter continued its orbit. From above, the geometry of the encounter told a different story. The closing angles that looked deliberate from the surface now seemed far more restricted. The Venezuelan ships had less room to maneuver without moving into clearly unsafe margins. An aircraft changes the equation in ways surface ships cannot. It narrows choices. At 1454, the first visible shift appeared. One Venezuelan warship reduced speed by a small but measurable amount. Another edged its course slightly outward, widening the separation by fractions of a mile. These were not withdrawals. They were recalculations. The helicopter made no sudden move. It held its altitude, kept a safe distance, and continued watching. Back on the carrier, flight activity stayed composed. No extra aircraft were sent up because none were required. The goal was never to overpower the moment. The goal was to make the situation unmistakably clear, and that clarity was starting to take shape. The Venezuelan formation was no longer perfectly aligned. The spacing between ships began to open. Their headings started to drift apart by small but meaningful degrees. These were not signs of collapse. They were signs of reconsideration. And at sea, reconsideration is often the first real step away from escalation. At 1457, a second advisory was transmitted. Shorter this time. A simple reminder about navigational safety and confirmation that every movement was being observed and documented. No threats, no ultimatums. The reply came faster, more formal this time. Still cautious, still controlled, but no longer vague. Above them, the helicopter's cameras captured everything. Movements on deck slowed. Officers stepped back inside. The visual rhythm had changed. It was the unmistakable body language of a force rethinking its next move. Below, the carrier strike group remained exactly as it had been. That was the point. In maritime standoffs, the side that waits longest often holds the advantage. By refusing to react too early, the strike group pushed the pressure back toward the ships that had created it. At 1502, the change became impossible to miss. The lead Venezuelan warship adjusted course away from the carrier's projected path. The turn was gradual, almost casual, shaped to avoid looking like a retreat. But the data showed what appearances tried to hide. The projected closest point of approach increased. Time to CPA stretched out. The helicopter shifted its orbit only enough to keep the ships in view. It did not chase. It did not crowd. Presence, not pursuit. Within minutes, the tension that had defined the last hour began to ease. Not in a dramatic flash, not with a single decisive moment, but in a slow and unmistakable unwinding. No shots, no escalated warnings, and yet the outcome was already forming. The helicopter remained overhead, a quiet witness to the resolution of a challenge built on proximity rather than force. And as the distance widened, one truth became clear to everyone involved. The moment of pressure had passed. What remained was the record, the restraint, and the unspoken understanding that at sea, the most decisive moves are often the least visible. By 1506 local time, the geometry of the encounter had changed again. Not sharply, not all at once, but enough to matter. The three Venezuelan warships were no longer closing in. Their formation had loosened, the growing space between them suggesting deliberate coordination rather than disorder. Their speed reductions were slight, barely noticeable to the eye, but unmistakable on radar. The numbers told the story before anyone needed to say it aloud. The closest point of approach was increasing. Inside the Combat Information Center, no one treated it like a victory. This was not a triumph. It was a transition. Encounters at sea rarely end with declarations. They end with decisions, often quiet ones, made when the balance of risk and reward changes. The helicopter stayed on station, holding a steady orbit. Its presence did not shift closer or farther. That consistency carried its own message. You were seen before, and you are still being seen now. On the Venezuelan ships, activity slowed. Movements on deck lost their earlier urgency. Personnel withdrew from exposed positions. Hatches closed. The outward posture of pressure gave way to internal reassessment. And that reassessment mattered. Naval challenges are rarely just about capability. More often, they are about controlling the story, testing limits without crossing them. The Venezuelan commanders had made their move. They had reduced the distance. They had ignored the first calls. But now, faced not with overreaction, but with layered awareness and calm control, they were recalculating. At 15:09, the lead Venezuelan vessel transmitted again. The message was formal and diplomatic in tone. It referred to sovereign patrol operations near national waters. It requested mutual awareness of distance and safe navigation. The language was carefully chosen, firm but not confrontational. The reply from the American side came immediately, calm and exact. International waters were reaffirmed. Lawful transit was stated clearly. Unsafe maneuvering had been documented. The tone did not rise. It did not soften. It simply stayed with the facts. And at sea, facts can carry more weight than force. From that point, the entire dynamic changed. The Venezuelan ships kept adjusting course, each movement small enough to preserve appearances, yet together large enough to change the outcome. The distance between the forces grew, relative bearings settled. The pressure that had defined the encounter slowly dissolved into open water. The helicopter completed another orbit, then widened its pattern slightly. It was not pulling away, it was signaling that the most intense phase had passed. Sensors stayed active. Recording continued. Nothing was treated as over until it was unquestionably over. On the carrier, nothing changed. The strike group held its speed, kept its heading, and maintained formation. That steadiness was not incidental. It was doctrine in action. By staying unchanged from start to finish, the carrier sent one message with complete clarity. The challenge had not altered its mission. That kind of clarity is hard to answer. By 1514, the Venezuelan warships were clearly no longer moving on intercept paths. Their heading separated further. One ship turned outward, creating greater lateral distance. Another slowed to a pace more consistent with routine patrol than deliberate approach. There was no announcement to mark the end of the standoff. There never is. Encounters like this usually fade the same way they began, through distance, documentation, and disciplined restraint. No one publicly stepped back. No side was openly embarrassed. But the balance had shifted, and it had shifted decisively. The helicopter received instructions to return. As it turned back toward the carrier, its sensors captured the last frames of the Venezuelan formation, receding into open water. Those images would be archived, reviewed, and filed with countless others from similar moments around the world. Each one a record, each one a lesson. On deck, the aircraft touched down smoothly. The rotors slowed. Crew members moved in with practiced precision. To anyone watching from afar, it might have looked like the end of an ordinary flight. In reality, it marked the close of a deliberate test. The Venezuelan ships continued along their revised courses, keeping their distance and no longer applying pressure. The carrier strike group remained on its original track, unaffected, uninterrupted, unchanged. No weapons were used, no warnings escalated, yet the result was unmistakable. At sea, power is not proved by force alone. It is proved by the ability to absorb pressure without reacting impulsively, to project presence without provoking a wider crisis, and to let time work in your favor. This encounter followed that script almost perfectly. And because of that, it ended not with spectacle or noise, but with distance restored and boundaries quietly made clear. By 1518 local time, the encounter was effectively over. The Venezuelan warships were no longer maneuvering as a coordinated group. Their courses had spread back into routine patrol patterns. Speed stabilized. Distance increased with every passing minute. On radar, the picture had returned to something that looked like ordinary maritime traffic. But what had just happened was far from ordinary. From the outside, there were no shots, no dramatic warnings, no visible confrontation on deck. To a casual observer, it might have seemed like 3 ships approached and then simply moved on. But that reading would miss the real story. What unfolded was a controlled test of boundaries and an equally controlled demonstration of how modern naval power is often exercised without violence. The Venezuelan commanders had chosen to apply pressure through proximity. They closed the distance deliberately, ignored the first radio calls, and shaped their movements to challenge presence without crossing into open hostility. It was a familiar gray zone tactic designed to probe reactions, measure responses, and send a political message without triggering outright conflict. What they met was not force, it was discipline. From the first radar contact to the final course change, the carrier strike group followed doctrine built around a single principle: control the escalation. Every move was measured, every choice was recorded. Nothing was hurried, nothing was improvised. The aircraft carrier did not turn away. It did not surge forward. It did not issue dramatic threats. It simply remained what it was, a steady center of gravity around which every other decision had to be made. And that steadiness matters. Aircraft carriers are often described through the language of raw capability. The aircraft they carry, the weapons they support, the ships that guard them. But in moments like this, their real value shows up somewhere else entirely. They compress time and space. They forced the opposing side to think beyond the next move and consider what would follow several steps later. Every mile that closed was tracked. Every unanswered radio call was logged. Every radar signal was captured. By choosing to apply pressure through proximity, the Venezuelan ships also made themselves easier to study. Their movements, transmissions, and electronic signatures were collected cleanly, without interference and without the need for direct confrontation. Information moved mostly in one direction, and that imbalance mattered. The moment the helicopter lifted off, the situation changed for good. Airborne sensors stripped away uncertainty and replaced it with a clearer picture. Intent became easier to read. Room to maneuver became tighter. Available options began to shrink. The pressure that had been pushed outward slowly started folding back on those who created it. And once reassessment began, it revealed itself in small but telling ways. Reduced speed, subtle course corrections, and the return of radio communication. None of those actions alone meant the challenge was over. Taken together, they clearly showed that it was. The carrier strike group did not chase. It did not try to capitalize. It did not look for a public concession because at sea, public concessions are rarely the real objective. The real objective is precedent. It is memory. It is the unspoken lesson both sides carry away about how far pressure can go before it starts working against the side applying it. That lesson was reinforced that afternoon. The Venezuelan warships left the encounter having made their political point. The United States left it without changing anything operationally. The carrier continued its transit. The strike group stayed intact. The mission moved forward without interruption. In situations like this, the advantage often belongs to the side that never has to change its course. Later, analysts would review the encounter frame by frame. Timelines would be rebuilt, distances would be mapped, communications would be examined, not to dramatize the event, but to improve future responses. Every encounter like this becomes part of a larger body of experience that shapes the next decision. Because this was not a one-off event. Encounters like this are happening more often across the world's oceans. They reflect an era in which rivalry increasingly replaces open conflict, and presence becomes the preferred tool of pressure. In that environment, restraint is not a sign of weakness. It is a form of strength. The real turning point in this encounter was not the moment the ships began to move away. It was the moment nothing else happened. No escalation, no misjudgment, no irreversible choice made in a moment of tension. That is the result modern navies train to achieve. And that is why, long after the radar picture cleared and the helicopter was secured on deck, the most important fact remained the same. The carrier stayed on course, the mission remained intact, and the balance at sea did not move. This will not be the last encounter of its kind. As competition at sea continues to intensify, these quiet, disciplined moments will shape maritime balance more and more. And when they do, the real story will rarely be about what was used. It will be about what never had to be.